On the edge of Paradise Valley, a struggling farmer led his weary horse toward the auction barn, ready to give her up forever. But as the storm rolled in and the bidding began, secrets long buried were forced into the light. What unfolded was not just a fight for survival, but a story of forgiveness, trust, and the bond between a man, his son, and a horse who refused to be forgotten. The first light of day spilled gently across Paradise Valley, laying a thin veil of silver mist over the fields. Ethan Rourke sat on the weathered porch of his ranch house, shoulders hunched beneath his old leather jacket, harmonica pressed to his lips. The tune was slow, almost hesitant, rising and falling like the faint breath of the earth itself. Out in the paddock, his gray mare, Silver Lark, lifted her head and turned her ears toward the sound. Her coat shimmered faintly in the pale light, dappled gray flecked with silver, as though the dawn itself had painted her. The house behind him was still quiet, but not with the peace of sleep, rather with the silence of a family that had grown careful with words. Ethan's wife, Maya, would soon be up, moving quietly through the kitchen, checking numbers in a ledger that never seemed to balance. His son, Caleb, would likely avoid the breakfast table, retreating instead to his camera and the landscapes he preferred to capture rather than the father he no longer spoke to. And June, his little girl, would bound out with hair tangled and eyes bright, too young to hide her love for the horse grazing beyond the fence. Ethan lowered the harmonica and breathed in the cold morning air, sharp with the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Bills sat piled on the counter inside, the electricity notice stamped in red, and the vet's invoice waiting like a stone in his chest. The ranch, once a place of pride, now felt like a burden strapped too tightly across his shoulders. Still, when he looked at Lark, standing steady against the slow drift of fog, there was something in him that softened. She was 20 years old, long past her prime, but she had been his partner through every roundup, every storm. Her ears still flicked toward him at the sound of his harmonica, as if she remembered the boy he had once been. The sun crept higher, painting the snowcaps of the Absaroka Range in fire and gold. The beauty was almost cruel. A valley this breathtaking had no mercy for men like him, men who could not keep up with the tide of debt and drought. Ethan rubbed his rough hands together, calloused palms that had fixed fences and pulled calves, but couldn't hold together a family fraying at the seams. He could already feel the conversation pressing against the day, Maya's steady voice urging him to face the truth, to make the choice he had avoided for too long. A crow cawed from the cottonwood tree, breaking the stillness. Lark lifted her head again, tail flicking, as though she too sensed something was about to change. Ethan slipped the harmonica back into his pocket, rose slowly, and watched the breath curl from her nostrils in the cold. He whispered under his breath, more to himself than to her, "Maybe today we start letting go." The words hung in the air as the door creaked open behind him. Maya's voice, soft but edged with fatigue, carried through the morning. "Ethan, we need to talk about the bills." Maya's words lingered in the doorway, fragile, yet immovable, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the kitchen. The small wooden table stood in the center of the room, cluttered with receipts and letters, the red stamps of overdue payments glaring like open wounds. Maya sat with her shoulders slightly curved, a pen tapping nervously against the ledger. She looked up at him, her face lined with fatigue, though the warmth that once filled her gaze had not entirely disappeared. It was buried, waiting, though even she didn't know where. "Ethan," she said, softer now, "we can't keep ignoring this." He wanted to argue, to push back, but the words never came. Instead, he moved toward the table, his boots thudding against the worn wood floor. He stared at the numbers as though they were a foreign language. It wasn't that he didn't understand. He knew too well what they meant. Another month behind, another loan coming due, another reminder that the land he had inherited was slipping through his fingers. He could still see his father's weathered face, the way the old man had placed the ranch deed in his hands years ago, telling him, "This land has a memory, son. Don't ever let it go." Back then, Ethan had believed the ranch would be his legacy, a place where his children could grow with the rhythm of the seasons. Now it felt more like a curse, a chain he carried alone. He wondered if his father had ever felt the same weight, or if it was only him, too stubborn to change, too proud to admit defeat. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Caleb emerged from the hallway, tall and restless, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He didn't look at his father. Instead, he moved to the counter, slung his camera bag over his shoulder, and poured himself coffee without a word. The silence was heavier than any argument. Ethan opened his mouth, searching for something. Anything to bridge the gap, but Caleb's shoulders stiffened, warning him away. "You going out again?" Maya asked gently. "Yeah," Caleb muttered, his voice flat. "I've got some shots I need to get before the light's gone." He was out the door before Ethan could answer. Through the window, Ethan watched his son stride toward the fields, camera swinging against his side. For a moment, he felt an ache that had nothing to do with bills or ranching. It was the distance between them, an expanse wider than the valley itself. "Don't take it out on him," Maya said, as if reading his thoughts. "He's still carrying more than he knows how to say." Ethan didn't reply. He thought of the accident, the rain-slick boards of the bridge, the horse's sudden halt, the fall that had changed everything. The memory pressed against him like a hand on his chest, but he swallowed it down. He had no language for grief, only silence. The sound of laughter drifted in from outside. June had woken, her small voice carrying as she ran to the paddock. Ethan followed the sound and saw her tugging gently at Lark's mane, whispering secrets only a child could imagine. The mare lowered her head, patient and still, as though she truly understood. June's joy was a kind of light Ethan barely recognized anymore, and for a fleeting second, it cut through the haze that had settled over the household. But Maya's voice pulled him back. "Wes Dalton's coming by today," she said, carefully folding one of the letters. "He said he might have some advice about the cattle prices, and maybe about the horse." The word horse lodged in Ethan's chest. He looked again at Lark, her silver coat gleaming in the morning sun. Selling her would mean letting go of the last steady thing in his life, the one creature that had carried him through storms, both real and remembered. Yet as he glanced back at Maya, the lines around her mouth, the worry etched across her brow, he knew she wasn't being cruel. She was trying to survive, for all of them. He pressed his hands against the table, rough palms against cold wood. "We'll talk when Wes gets here," he said finally. Maya nodded, relief flickering across her face, though it quickly faded. The silence returned, heavy but resigned. Outside, June's laughter mingled with the low rumble of Lark's breath. Inside, the sound of the pen scratching across the ledger filled the space between husband and wife. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He moved to the window, staring out at the snow-capped peaks that framed the valley. They were beautiful, eternal, indifferent. His father's words echoed again, but this time they felt like a question rather than a command. Don't ever let it go. And Ethan wondered, for the first time, if perhaps holding on was the very thing that was breaking them. The sound of an old pickup rumbled down the dirt road, echoing through the stillness of the valley. Dust rose behind it in the brittle morning air, and Ethan knew before he even saw the truck who it was. Wes Dalton. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, as the vehicle pulled into the yard, the engine sputtering to a stop. The door creaked open, and Wes stepped out, a man shaped by years of bargaining, his hat brim shadowing sharp eyes that always measured more than they revealed. "Morning, Ethan," Wes said, his voice gravelly, polite enough but clipped at the edges. He gave a small nod toward the paddock where Silver Lark stood grazing. "Still holding on to her, huh?" Ethan felt the words like a hook, but he didn't flinch. He shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains lifted clean and cold against the sky. "She's been here a long time." "Long time don't pay bills," Wes answered simply. He walked closer, boots crunching over gravel, and rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. His eyes studied the mare the way a man studies cattle. Weight, muscle, resale value. "She's past her working years, Ethan. You know it as well as I do. But there's still folks down near Bozeman that'd pay something. Not much, but enough to keep the lights on for another month." Maya appeared in the doorway, her arms folded tightly against her chest. She didn't speak, but Ethan could feel her presence, the quiet pressure of her gaze. He hated that Wes's words seemed to echo her unspoken fears. "She's not just some animal to unload," Ethan said at last, his voice low. Wes chuckled without humor. "You think I don't know that? I've sold horses that carried me through storms. But at the end of the day, Ethan, you either feed your family or you hold on to pride. Can't always do both." He tapped the fence rail with his knuckles, eyes narrowing slightly. "There's an auction in Bozeman this week. I can haul her down. Get you a fair bid?" The offer settled into the air like dust. Ethan's jaw tightened. The image of June hugging Lark's neck that very morning flashed before him. He imagined Caleb's distant stare hardening even more if the horse was gone. And still, the weight of the ledger sat heavy in his chest. Maya finally spoke, her tone careful, as if she were choosing each word like a stone to step on across a river. "It's not about pride, Wes. It's about what's possible. We can't keep bleeding out like this." Ethan turned toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time in days. There was no malice there, only fatigue and a plea he couldn't ignore. He wanted to argue, to tell her that selling the horse would break something in him that couldn't be repaired. But what good were words when the bank didn't care about broken hearts? The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of rain. Lark lifted her head, ears flicking, as though she too felt the tension humming in the yard. Ethan remembered another storm. Another night, the sharp crack of hooves on slick wood, the scream swallowed by rain. He forced the memory back down, swallowing hard. Wes leaned closer. "Think about it, Ethan. You've held on longer than most would. Nobody's going to blame you for letting go." He tipped his hat and turned back toward his truck. The engine roared to life, leaving behind the smell of exhaust and the echo of a choice that felt less like an option and more like a demand. When the dust settled, Ethan stood alone by the fence. Maya lingered in the doorway, her face unreadable. Across the yard, June's laughter drifted as she chased after Lark's swishing tail, unaware of the storm gathering around her. Caleb's figure could just be seen in the distance, camera slung across his back, walking farther from home. The clouds thickened over the valley, heavy with the promise of rain. Ethan tightened his fists inside his pockets, the old leather creaking. He knew the storm was coming, not just in the sky, but in the choices he would soon have to make. He whispered under his breath, words swallowed by the rising wind. Maybe they're right. Maybe I can't hold on. The first drop of rain splattered against his cheek, cold and sharp, as if the valley itself had given its verdict. Rain drummed against the tin roof of the ranch house that night, a steady rhythm that seemed to seep into every corner of the rooms. Ethan sat at the kitchen table long after supper, staring at the half-empty plates. The stew had gone cold, untouched. Across from him, Maya folded her hands, her eyes lowered to the tablecloth, as if studying its worn threads. Neither of them had spoken since Wes's truck rattled away that morning. Silence was easier than words that might break what little held them together. Caleb had eaten quickly, barely tasting the food, then slipped away with his camera. Ethan heard the back door close, the creak of boots on wet boards, and then only the rain. His son had become a shadow in his own home, a figure always moving just out of reach. June lingered, chattering about the drawings she had made at school, about how she had brushed Lark's mane until it gleamed silver. Her voice filled the room with fragile warmth. But when she looked at her parents and found no answer, even her small smile faltered. She excused herself and padded down the hall, leaving the clatter of dishes in the sink behind her. Maya finally lifted her gaze. "We can't keep pretending this will fix itself," she said, her voice quiet but edged with exhaustion. "The ranch is bleeding us dry, Ethan." "You know it." He rubbed his palms together, rough against rough, and forced himself to meet her eyes. "I know." "And Lark," she hesitated, the name catching in her throat. "Wes is right about one thing. Keeping her isn't just about sentiment anymore. She eats what we can't afford to spare." The words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her that Lark wasn't just an animal, that she was the last piece of himself he trusted. But he saw the lines carved deep into Maya's face, the fatigue from nights spent balancing bills, and his resolve wavered. Still, he said nothing. Silence, again, became his shield. The storm outside thickened, lightning flickering across the valley. Ethan's chest tightened as the thunder rolled. He remembered another storm, years ago, the wet slap of rain against his jacket, the sudden stop of hooves on a bridge, and Caleb's scream swallowed by the night. The memory pressed so hard against him he rose abruptly from the table, chair scraping across the floor. Maya flinched at the sound, but didn't follow. He stepped out onto the porch, the rain soaking his shoulders within seconds. Across the yard, Lark stood near the fence, her head low, her body trembling under the onslaught of water and noise. Ethan crossed the mud, boots sinking into the earth, and reached her. He placed a hand against her damp neck. She shuddered beneath his touch, muscles tight, ears twitching with each crack of thunder. "It's all right, girl," he whispered, though his own voice was unsteady. "It's just a storm." But it wasn't just a storm. For both of them, it was the ghost of that night. The horse pressed closer, seeking comfort, and Ethan found himself pressing his forehead against her wet mane. For a moment, He let himself breathe with her, their breaths ragged, uneven, but shared. He wanted to believe that meant something, that maybe, even if the world was slipping away, he wasn't entirely alone. Behind him, the porch light flicked on. Maya stood in the doorway, watching. Her silhouette was rigid, her arms crossed, but her face, softened by the glow of light, held something that looked almost like sorrow. She didn't call out, didn't tell him to come inside. She only watched, her silence saying more than words could. When the storm finally eased, Ethan led Lark back into the stall and shut the gate. The mare snorted, shaking the rain from her coat, and settled against the straw. Ethan lingered there, leaning on the gate, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. Later, when he slipped into bed, Maya was already lying on her side, facing the window. He slid under the blanket, careful not to brush against her. They lay like strangers, two bodies in the same bed separated by more than space. Outside, water still dripped from the eaves, each drop a steady metronome counting the seconds of their silence. And in that silence, Ethan felt the question echo louder than thunder. How much longer could they go on this way? The morning broke gray and heavy. Clouds stretched low over the valley like a ceiling that threatened to collapse. Ethan stood in the barn, tightening the worn leather halter around Lark's head. His hands moved with the slow precision of a man who had done this countless times, but today each buckle felt heavier, every strap an anchor. The mare shifted uneasily, her hooves thudding against the straw, as though she sensed the change in the air. June appeared in the doorway, hair tangled from sleep, her nightgown tucked into rubber boots. "Daddy, where are you taking her?" Her voice carried a fragile brightness, the kind that made Ethan's throat close. He crouched to meet her eyes. "Just a trip to town," he said softly. "We'll be back soon." But even a child could hear the hollow space behind his words. June's lower lip trembled, and she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Lark's damp muzzle. The horse lowered her head, pressing into the girl's embrace. Ethan had to turn away before his daughter's tears undid him completely. By the time Caleb appeared, the truck was idling in the yard, its old trailer rattling. The boy kept his distance, his camera hanging from its strap like a shield. He didn't offer to help load Lark, and Ethan didn't ask. Their silence had become its own language, filled with things they refused to say. Maya stood by the porch, arms folded tight against her chest. She didn't cry, didn't plead. Her stillness was worse. It felt like consent, like she had already let the horse go in her heart. When Ethan led Lark up the ramp, the mare balked, hooves clanging against metal. He steadied her, murmuring words only half-formed, and finally she stepped inside. The clang of the gate closing echoed through the yard like a verdict. The road out of Paradise Valley was slick with the night's rain, the truck groaning as it pulled the weight of the trailer. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks shrouded in mist, as if even the land itself was turning its face away. Ethan kept his hands locked on the wheel, eyes fixed straight ahead. Maya sat beside him, silent, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Behind them, Caleb rode in the truck bed, his camera pointed outward, capturing landscapes that blurred by like fading memories. Halfway to Bozeman, the sky opened again. Rain pounded the windshield, the wipers slashing back and forth in frantic rhythm. In the trailer, Lark whinnied, the sound carrying through the thin metal walls. Ethan's chest tightened at the sound. He pulled to the side of the road, tires skidding slightly in the mud. The rain hammered down, washing the world into shades of gray. "Stay here," he told Maya, though his voice was rough, almost broken. He climbed out into the storm, boots splashing in puddles, and hurried to the trailer. Lark was trembling, her body slick with sweat, though the air was cold. She stamped her hooves, head tossing against the halter, eyes wide with fear. Ethan climbed inside, the space narrow and swaying with each gust of wind. "Easy, girl," he murmured, pressing a hand against her flank. His harmonica was still in his pocket, heavy against his thigh. Without thinking, he pulled it free, cupped it to his lips, and let a single note spill into the cramped space. The sound was low, wavering at first, then steady. Rain drummed on the metal roof, thunder rolled across the valley, but the thin silver thread of music wove between the chaos. Lark's ears flicked forward. She stilled, just slightly, her breathing slowing as she listened. Ethan played on, a tune half-remembered from boyhood, simple and plaintive. The mare lowered her head until her forehead pressed gently against his shoulder. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Ethan felt something inside him loosen. His own breath fell into rhythm with hers, their bodies swaying together with the storm. Behind him, through the rain, he heard the truck door open. Tian turned his head just enough to see Caleb standing there, camera hanging limp at his side, his expression caught between disbelief and something softer. For a moment, father and son locked eyes. No words passed, but Ethan knew Caleb had seen something that mattered. He pocketed the harmonica, gave Lark a final pat, and stepped back into the storm. She stood calmer now, her sides rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He closed the trailer door, rain streaming down his face, and climbed back into the truck. Maya looked at him, her eyes searching, but she said nothing. The silence between them was different this time. Not empty, but waiting. The truck pulled back onto the road, its tires cutting through the flooded gravel. Behind them, Lark shifted once, then settled. Ahead, Bozeman waited, with its auction barns and unforgiving choices. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter, knowing he had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bozeman's fairgrounds were alive with noise and motion by the time Ethan pulled the truck into the muddy lot. Trailers lined the edges like tired beasts, their sides dripping with rain. The scent of wet hay, diesel, and livestock pressed into the air, thick and unavoidable. Auctioneers' voices rose and fell inside the barns, rapid-fire chants mixed with the lowing of cattle and the restless whinny of horses. It was a world of trade, where every sound was about money gained or lost, and Ethan felt like he was walking his family's heart into a market. Caleb jumped down from the truck bed before Ethan could say anything. The boy adjusted the strap of his camera, eyes scanning the bustle with a mixture of detachment and curiosity. For all his distance at home, here he seemed alive, soaking in the colors and chaos through his lens. He lifted the camera and snapped a shot of a cowboy leading a colt through the puddles, then another of children pressing their hands against the wooden rails, their eyes wide with wonder. Ethan almost told him to stay close, but the words stuck. Caleb had stopped listening long ago. Maya remained by the truck, folding her arms tight. Her eyes followed Ethan as he led Lark from the trailer. The mare hesitated, hooves clanging against the ramp, before stepping into the churn of mud. She tossed her head, uneasy, and Ethan steadied her with a firm hand on the halter. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his own stomach knotted. That was when he noticed her, standing near the edge of the barn doors, camera in hand, rain dripping from her hood. A young woman, not much older than Caleb, with sharp, curious eyes that seemed to catch everything. She raised her camera, clicked once, then lowered it, studying Ethan and Lark as if she had seen something no one else could. Caleb noticed too. His steps slowed, his own camera lowering slightly. The young woman approached with an easy confidence, wiping rain from her lens. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the din around them. Ethan nodded stiffly. Compliments felt hollow here, among the smell of money and loss. But Caleb's interest sharpened. "What kind of camera?" he asked, his tone cautious but edged with curiosity. She smiled, holding it up. "Canon, full frame. I'm Charlie." Her eyes flicked between father and son before settling on the horse again. "I travel to capture stories of places that are fading." The quiet corners people forget, Caleb shifted, pulling his own camera closer. "I take landscapes," he said, almost defensive. Charlie tilted her head, studying him the way she had studied Ethan moments before. "Landscapes are good, but sometimes it's the living that tell the story best." She glanced again at Lark, who stood patient despite the storm of noise around her. "Like her." "She looks like she's been through something." Ethan bristled. He didn't want strangers reading history in the slope of his horse's back. But Caleb's eyes softened. For once, someone else had given words to what he couldn't say. That the horse carried more than weight. She carried memory. Before Ethan could respond, the auctioneer's voice boomed from inside the barn, calling for the next round. The crowd shifted, boots slapping against wet boards, voices rising. Maya touched Ethan's arm lightly. "It's time," she said. Ethan nodded, leading Lark forward. Charlie stepped aside, but her gaze lingered, following them into the barn. Caleb trailed behind, snapping a few more photos, though his lens kept drifting back to the stranger with the camera. Inside, the light dimmed, filtered through dust and old rafters. The wooden floorboards echoed with every step, and the smell of animals and fear pressed in closer. Ethan tightened his grip on the halter. Lark's ears twitched, nostrils flaring. He could feel her pulse quicken through the rope. For a moment he thought of turning back, of walking straight out into the rain and driving home. But the weight of Maya's eyes, the memory of Wes's words, and the stack of bills waiting on the kitchen table all pinned him in place. He led Lark into the holding pen, the gate closing with a metallic clang behind them. From the stands, a murmur rose as buyers leaned forward, appraising, calculating. Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him. This was more than selling a horse. It was selling a part of himself, a part of the life he had promised to protect. And somewhere behind him, Caleb's camera clicked again, capturing the moment when his father's silence was laid bare for the world. The barn swallowed them whole, the air thick with dust, and the tang of manure. Light slanted through high windows, painting streaks of gold across the rafters, but the glow only deepened the shadows around the crowd. Men in hats leaned against rails, eyes sharp, murmuring numbers. The chant of the auctioneer echoed like a drumbeat, his words tumbling over one another in a rhythm designed to blur thought into impulse. Ethan led Lark forward, his hand steady on the rope, though his heart hammered. The mare balked at the sudden clamor, her ears twisting back, nostrils flaring. He whispered low, trying to calm her, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears, dry and cracked. Behind him, Maya stood stiff in the stands, her face pale in the dim light. Caleb lingered a few steps back, camera raised, but hands trembling. He caught images as though to freeze what could not be stopped. When the gate swung open, the noise swelled. Ethan guided Lark into the small ring at the barn's center, the floor slick with sawdust and old sweat. The rope tightened in his hand as she stepped cautiously, her hooves clicking against the boards. The crowd leaned closer, eyes assessing. Age, strength, scars hidden beneath a silver coat. Ethan felt each gaze like a knife. The auctioneer's chant picked up, sharp and fast. Numbers leapt into the air, caught and passed like sparks. A bid came quickly, then another, higher than expected. Ethan blinked, stunned. For a fleeting moment, relief washed through him. Maybe, just maybe, the mare could bring enough to cover the most pressing debts, to ease Maya's burden, to keep the lights on for another season. He glanced at her in the stands. Her eyes met his, full of quiet hope she dared not voice. For the first time in months, he almost allowed himself to believe they might find a way forward. But Lark was not blind to the storm. The mare tossed her head, her muscles quivering as the auctioneer's voice bounced off the metal roof. The smell of sweat and fear grew thick, and she shifted, her hind hooves scraping against the boards. Ethan tightened his grip, murmuring again, but the rope pulled taut. Caleb lowered his camera, his face stricken. Through his lens he had captured strangers raising their hands, eyes fixed not on the horse, but on the numbers she represented. It sickened him. To them, Lark was nothing but a line in a ledger. To him, she was memory. She was the ghost of the night that still haunted his dreams. One buyer shouted another bid, higher still, and murmurs swept the barn. Even Wes Dalton, leaning against a post near the back, raised his brows in surprise. The numbers were climbing, not toward riches but toward possibility. Ethan felt the ground tilt again. Could it be this simple? Sell the horse? Clear the slate? Buy time to breathe? The chant grew louder, the auctioneer slapping the rail for emphasis. Maya's hands clutched the edge of her seat, knuckles white. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. Charlie, the young photographer, had slipped inside the barn, her camera snapping quietly from the shadows. She captured Ethan's face, the strain etched deep, the way his eyes clung to the horse, as though afraid to blink. Then, just as the bid hung in the air, a sound cracked the moment open, the sharp patter of rain against the tin roof, sudden and loud. The barn seemed to inhale, the crowd glancing, upward as the storm rolled overhead. To Lark, it was more than rain. Her body stiffened, head jerking high, eyes rolling white. She snorted, chest heaving, the rope jerking in Ethan's hand. The mare remembered, just as he did, the night of the bridge, the slick boards, the fall. The auctioneer's chant faltered for half a beat before resuming, but the rhythm had changed. Ethan's grip tightened, his voice rising in a whisper meant only for the horse. But Lark's tremors ran into his arm, into his bones. He felt the same panic rising, the same helplessness that had never left him. Maya rose halfway from her seat, lips parted. Caleb froze, his camera still raised, as though capturing his father's unraveling. Charlie leaned forward, the shutter of her camera soft but insistent. The bids were still climbing, but Ethan no longer heard them. All he heard was the rain, the thunder in his chest, and the ragged breath of the horse beside him. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that no number could measure what stood trembling at the end of his rope. The auctioneer slammed his palm on the rail again, calling for the final bid. Ethan's vision tunneled, the noise dimming until only Lark's eyes filled his world. Wild, frightened, searching for something she could trust. And in that gaze, Ethan saw himself. The barn seemed to shrink as the storm thickened overhead, rain slamming against the tin roof like fists demanding to be heard. The sound was relentless, drowning out the auctioneer's rhythm until his words blurred into noise. For Lark, it was more than weather. It was memory come alive. Her chest heaved, hooves striking the slick boards, eyes wide with terror that reached back to a night no one could forget. Ethan clung to the rope, knuckles white, his boots slipping slightly in the sawdust. He spoke in low tones, the same words he'd whispered in storms before, but they barely reached her. Each thunderclap sent her jerking, the rope burning his palm. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rising. A horse in panic was dangerous, and buyers did not want broken creatures. Numbers fell silent. Caleb stood frozen, his camera lifted but no longer clicking. Through the lens, he saw not just a horse fighting shadows, but the echo of his own guilt. He remembered the slick planks of the bridge, the way he had dug his heels in, urging Lark forward that night. He remembered the sharp lurch when she refused, the sudden fall, his body crashing into the riverbank, his father's arms pulling him up, the fury in Ethan's eyes at himself, never at his son. Caleb had never confessed the truth, that it had been his insistence, his pride, that drove them into the storm. Now, as rain hammered the roof, the weight of silence pressed too hard. His breath came short, his throat raw. "It wasn't you," he blurted suddenly, his voice breaking through the barn. "Dad, it wasn't your fault." The words cut through the noise sharper than thunder. Ethan froze, his grip still tight on the rope, his head snapping toward his son. The crowd went still, the auctioneer lowering his chant mid-word. Maya's hands flew to her mouth. Caleb's chest heaved as the dam burst. "That night, it was me. I kept pushing her. I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. You told me to turn back, but I wouldn't. When she stopped on the bridge, I struck her. I made her jump forward, and I fell. You've carried the blame, but it was never yours." The confession poured out, jagged and raw. The barn seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's vision blurred with more than rain as he stared at his son, the boy he thought had turned away from him. All these years, he had carried the weight like a stone, certain it was his failure that had shattered their family. And now the truth stood before him, trembling and alive. Lark shuddered again, hooves striking, snapping Ethan back to the present. He tightened his hold, pulling her head close, whispering fiercely. "Easy, girl. You're safe." The mare's wild eyes flicked between father and son, as if she too understood that something had shifted. In the stands, whispers rippled. Buyers leaned back, uninterested now. No one wanted a horse tied to ghosts. Wes Dalton shook his head, muttering under his breath, but Ethan no longer cared. The auctioneer called weakly for another bid, but no voices rose. The sale was slipping through. Ethan looked again at Caleb. The boy's eyes were red, his face pale, but unflinching. For the first time in years, Ethan saw not defiance, but honesty. A bridge broken might still be rebuilt. His chest tightened, and he knew he could not let this moment pass. He dropped the rope into both hands, steadying himself against Lark's trembling body, and spoke low enough for his son to hear. "You were just a boy," he said. "I should have known better. But I swear to you, Caleb, none of that changes what you are to me." The words landed heavy in the hush. Caleb's shoulders sagged, his camera lowering. The years of silence cracked. Maya's eyes glistened, though she stayed rooted to her place, watching her husband and son find each other again in the most unlikely of arenas. Charlie's camera clicked once, the sound sharp, capturing the raw fracture of a family piecing itself back together. And above them all, the storm roared on, rain hammering the tin roof as if to remind them that healing never came in quiet, but in noise and breaking, and fear survived together. Ethan pulled Lark close, her breath warm against his arm. He no longer cared for bids or debts. What mattered stood before him, trembling but true. A son's confession, a father's release, a family's wound torn open so it might finally heal. The storm still lingered over the valley as Ethan guided the truck out of Bozeman, the wipers beating a steady rhythm across the windshield. The auction barn had fallen behind them, but the weight of it clung like smoke in their clothes. No, one spoke. The only sounds were the groan of the engine, the rain striking metal, and the uneven breaths of the horse shifting in the trailer. Maya sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her face turned toward the window. Streetlights and wet pavement streaked across the glass, blurring into a wash of color. Her reflection looked ghost-like. Hollow eyes, lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't said a word since Caleb's confession. Ethan wanted to reach for her hand, but his own gripped the wheel too tightly, knuckles pale against the leather. Words formed and died in his throat before they could cross the distance between them. In the back seat, Caleb sat hunched forward, his camera resting in his lap. His fingers traced the body of it absently, as though touch alone could erase the weight of what he'd spoken. He hadn't looked at his father since the barn. He hadn't needed to. The silence between them now was not the old silence, sharp and punishing. It was something else, raw, broken open, waiting. The trailer rattled over potholes, and Lark's hoofbeats echoed faintly inside. Ethan glanced at the side mirror, catching a glimpse of her gray shape shifting in the dim light. She was steady now, though every so often he felt her shift, as though still unsettled by the storm. He murmured softly under his breath, too quiet for the others to hear. "Almost home, girl." They drove past fields drowned in rain, the fences leaning under the weight of water, the land itself sagging in exhaustion. For Ethan, the valley had never looked so unforgiving. He wondered if it was punishing him, reminding him that the land never forgot, even if people tried. Maya broke the silence first, her voice low and fragile. "You knew all these years, and you never told us?" Caleb's answer was immediate, his words rough. "I was scared. I thought, if I said it, he'd hate me. Or you would." Ethan tightened his jaw, forcing his eyes to stay on the road. He spoke carefully, each word weighed before release. "Son, I never hated you. I hated myself." The truth hung there, heavy. Caleb swallowed hard, blinking fast as if fighting something back. He didn't reply, but his shoulders eased, just barely, the smallest crack in the armor he had worn for years. Maya pressed her hand against her mouth, eyes shimmering. She turned back toward the window, unwilling to let them see the tears forming. The rain outside mirrored her grief, streaking the glass until everything blurred. They reached the long gravel road leading back into Paradise Valley. The truck's headlights cut a narrow path through the dark, illuminating the endless fields and the Absaroka peaks rising like watchmen in the distance. Ethan slowed, the crunch of gravel under the tires steady but final. Each stone a reminder that they were returning to a home still broken, though the first words of healing had been spoken. As they pulled into the yard, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a faint glow against the wet boards. June must have left it burning for them, a small act of hope in a house that had known too little of it. Ethan parked and killed the engine. For a moment, no one moved. The silence inside the cab was a living thing, thick and breathing. Caleb shifted, his hand tightening on the camera. Maya wiped quickly at her eyes, steadying herself before the door opened. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "We'll figure it out," he said, though the words sounded uncertain even to him. Still, they were the first words to break the wait, and in the dim light of the yard, they felt like a fragile promise. The family stepped out into the damp night, the air cool and sharp. Ethan moved to the trailer, lowering the ramp. Lark stepped carefully onto the wet gravel, her coat glistening silver in the light. She shook her mane, exhaling in a long, weary breath. Caleb stood nearby, watching, his camera forgotten at his side. Maya lingered on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, as if bracing for the unknown. Ethan laid a hand on the mare's neck, steadying her as she moved toward the barn. The sound of her hooves against the ground echoed in the quiet, carrying more weight than any words spoken that day. Behind him, he heard Caleb's footsteps follow, not rushing, not hesitant, but steady. For the first time in a long while, father and son walked in the same direction. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that barely seemed to touch the valley. The rain had passed, but its weight remained in the air, a dampness that seeped into the walls of the house and into the silence that still hung over the Rourke family. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread before him, their edges curled from handling. At the top of the pile lay the auction contract, Wes's promise that one sale could ease the burden, if only Ethan would let go. He stared at the page until the numbers blurred. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. The pen lay across the paper, uncapped, as though daring him to sign. But his hand would not move. The echoes of Caleb's confession still pulsed through him, each word a stone thrown into waters long stilled. Ethan's guilt had cracked, but in its place came a harder truth. That selling Lark now would mean breaking something else entirely. The house stirred around him. Maya moved quietly, tidying dishes, though her eyes kept flicking toward the table. Caleb had not yet come down, but Ethan could hear the faint sound of a guitar from upstairs. Tentative notes, searching for shape. June burst in from the barn, cheeks flushed, her boots muddy. "Daddy, she's calm now," she said, her voice bright. "I brushed her, and she leaned her head on me." Like she was listening, Ethan closed his eyes. The image of his daughter with Lark, small arms reaching, the horse bending low to meet her, pressed against his heart like a question he could no longer avoid. He looked again at the paper. Numbers, debts, relief promised in neat rows. And yet, what would remain once the ink dried? His father's voice rose unbidden in memory. "This land has a memory, son. Don't ever let it go." But it wasn't just the land. It was the living memory standing out in the barn, breathing, watching him with trust he no longer deserved. Maya dried her hands on a towel, her expression unreadable. "Ethan," she said softly, "we can't keep circling this." "The bills won't vanish. I know." His voice cracked. He pushed the paper toward her, then pulled it back again. His hands trembled with the indecision of a man torn between survival and soul. Finally, with a suddenness that startled even himself, he gripped the contract in both fists. The paper tore in two. Then, again, until it was nothing but scraps scattered across the table. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet kitchen. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then something shifted. Not anger, not despair, but a strange release. The weight that had pressed so long on their shoulders lifted just slightly, as if by tearing the page, Ethan had made space for something else to breathe. Caleb appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. His eyes darted to the torn paper, then to his father's face. For the first time in years, he saw not defeat, but resolve. Their gazes held, and in that silent exchange, Ethan felt the faintest thread of trust stretch between them. Fragile, yes, but real. Maya's eyes filled, though she blinked the tears back quickly. "Then what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Ethan stood slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. He moved to the window, looking out at the barn where Lark stood framed in sunlight, breaking through the clouds. Her silver coat glistened, damp from the storm, but radiant still. He let out a long breath, the kind that felt like the first true breath in years. "We keep her," he said, "and we find another way." The words were simple, but they landed heavy, like nails driven into new wood. Maya closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging with both fear and relief. Caleb stepped farther into the room, his camera forgotten at his side. June squealed softly, clapping her hands. Outside, the valley stretched wide and quiet, the Absaroka peaks sharp against the clearing sky. The storm had passed, but the road ahead was unpaved, uncertain. Yet for the first time, Ethan felt that uncertainty might hold possibility, not just loss. He turned back to his family, his voice steady now. No more silence. No more carrying this alone. And in the fragments of paper scattered across the table, something new began to take shape. Not an answer, but a beginning. The scraps of torn paper still littered the kitchen table the next morning, a silent testimony to Ethan's choice. Sunlight pushed through the windows in thin, reluctant beams, catching on the jagged edges. Maya moved quietly around them, as if afraid the pieces might reassemble themselves into a burden again. June, still humming from yesterday's relief, tied ribbons in her braids and skipped toward the barn. Caleb lingered at the edge of the room, camera hanging loose at his side, watching his father with new eyes, hesitant but curious. Ethan felt the shift. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the fragile breath after a storm, the hush that allowed something new to be heard. Still, the weight of the unsolved pressed against him. They had chosen to keep Lark, but keeping her didn't erase the debt or the demands of the land. Every acre outside the window whispered of bills waiting to be paid. It was Dr. Louise Hart who came by first, her old Jeep crunching into the yard just after noon. She carried herself the way she always had, direct, no nonsense, but her eyes softened when they landed on Lark grazing by the fence. "So she's still here," Louise said, stepping down. "Good. I'd have hated to see her disappear at an auction." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "We made a decision." Louise studied him a long moment, then smiled faintly. "About time." Her gaze drifted toward the house where Maya stood in the doorway. But I imagine that decision came with a price. You can't feed a family on stubbornness, Ethan. Her words might have stung once, but Ethan found himself nodding. You're right. Louise leaned against the fence, arms folded. I've seen her calm children before, you know. The way she lowers her head, lets them place their hands on her without fear. She has a gift. She looked back at Ethan, her eyes narrowing as if testing a thought. What if you put that gift to work? Not hauling cattle, not for sale, but for healing. The word hung in the air. Healing. Ethan frowned. You mean therapy? Call it what you like, Louise said. There are kids in this valley who've been through things. Accidents, losses, fear that clings. Some of them can't find words. But sometimes with a horse like Lark, they don't need words. Maya stepped closer, her brow furrowed, but there was a spark in her eyes. Louise, you really think people would bring their children here? They'd come, Louise answered firmly. And not just children. Veterans. Folks carrying things heavier than their hands can hold. Lark has survived storms. She can teach others how to stand in the rain. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I'm no therapist. I barely keep this place standing. You don't have to be, Louise said. You just have to be willing. And you're not alone, she glanced toward Caleb, who had edged closer. That camera of his, stories matter. People need to see what you're trying to build. They'll help if they can believe in it. Caleb stiffened under the attention, but something flickered across his face, an interest he couldn't hide. For years, he had captured the valley in silence. Could those images finally say something for him? Ethan looked from his son to his wife, then back to Lark in the field. The mare lifted her head, ears flicking, her breath rising in a white plume against the cool air. He thought of June's small hands on her mane, of the way Caleb had lowered his camera during the storm, of Maya's tired but unbroken strength. Healing. Maybe it wasn't foolish. Maybe it was the only path left. That night, after Louise had gone, the family sat at the table together. No torn contracts, no plates left cold, just soup, bread, and the tentative warmth of voices. Caleb broke the silence first. I could put something together, he said. Photos, maybe even a short film. Show people what she's like. What this place could be. Ethan met his son's eyes, surprised by the offer. You'd do that? Caleb shrugged, but his voice was steady. She saved me once. Maybe she can save others. Maya reached for Ethan's hand under the table, her grip firm. Then we try. Whatever it takes. The fire in the stove crackled softly. Outside, the valley stretched under a blanket of stars. The land hadn't changed, the debts hadn't vanished, but in that small circle of light, possibility had returned. And at the heart of it stood a gray mare with silver in her coat and storms in her memory, ready to lead them toward something they could not yet name. The valley had always been wide, but for the Rourke family, it had often felt isolating, a land too vast to echo their struggles back to anyone else. Yet word has a way of traveling in small towns, carried on church pew whispers, over counters at the feed store, and in the low conversations at the diner. By the end of the week, neighbors began to appear one by one, each with something in their hands, something they could spare. It started with old Mr. Kavanaugh, who backed his truck into the yard and unloaded 3 bales of alfalfa without a word. His joints were stiff, his breath wheezed, but he grinned when June rushed up to hug him. "For the mare," he said simply, and drove away before Ethan could protest. The next morning, Mary Ellen from down the road left a sack of oats on the porch, tied with twine and a note in her looping hand. "Every good ranch deserves a second chance." Ethan stood at the window watching these small offerings pile up like unexpected blessings. It unsettled him as much as it warmed him. He had never asked for help. Pride had kept his voice locked in his chest. Yet now, here they came, neighbors who had their own troubles but still found something to give. Caleb captured the moments through his lens, June carrying a bale almost as tall as herself, Maya kneeling to untie the twine around the oats, Ethan standing awkwardly by, his hands empty but his eyes full. For the first time, Caleb's photographs weren't landscapes. They were people. His people, framed not by distance but by closeness. Charlie returned as well, her camera slung over her shoulder, curious as ever. She asked if she could document what was happening, and Ethan surprised himself by agreeing. She followed June into the barn, snapping as the girl brushed Lark's mane into a silver sheen. "She looks like she knows she's being admired," Charlie said with a laugh, and June giggled as if the horse understood. Later that week, Ethan found himself at the diner, his coffee cooling as he listened to murmurs from the next booth. Folks were talking about the Rourke's Healing Ranch, though no one had named it aloud before. It startled him. The idea had already taken root in other people's mouths, carrying a life of its own. When he walked out, 2 men nodded at him in quiet solidarity. For the first time in years, he didn't lower his head. At home, the family gathered in the barn after supper. Caleb set up his camera on a tripod, explaining he wanted to film, not just photograph. His voice trembled with nerves, but when Lark stepped into the frame, calm under the low light, he steadied. He captured June's laughter as she braided ribbons into the horse's mane, Maya's quiet smile as she leaned against the stall, and Ethan's rough hand resting gently on the mare's neck. "I'll cut it together," Caleb said later, scrolling through the footage. "Show the story, not the debts, not the bills, but the hope. People might want to be part of it." Ethan nodded slowly. He was still learning how to speak to his son, how to bridge years of silence. But he felt something solid in those words. "Do it," he said. "Let them see her." The night ended with the family standing together outside, the sky vast and clear, the peaks sharp in the starlight. The valley was still the same, but the air felt different, less like an empty expanse, more like a vessel slowly filling. And as Ethan looked at the small pile of hay and oats in the barn, at the flicker of resolve in Caleb's eyes, and at Maya's hand resting on his arm, he realized the neighbors hadn't just given supplies. They had given him permission to believe again. By late October, the valley wore its autumn colors like a quilt stitched from fire and gold. Cottonwoods blazed yellow along the riverbanks, and the high peaks carried the first dusting of snow. But the beauty was fragile. Clouds gathered heavy and dark on the horizon, promising another storm. Ethan felt it in his bones before the first gust bent the trees. The kind of weather that didn't just change the sky, but pressed against the heart. He had been repairing the old fence when Caleb came up the path, camera slung at his side. "Charlie thinks we should film something more personal," the boy said, hesitating. "Not just neighbors bringing hay." "She says people connect with stories of facing fears." His eyes flicked toward the old wooden bridge that crossed the narrow creek in the back pasture, the same bridge they avoided since the accident. The boards still sagged, the rails scarred by years of weather. Ethan followed his son's gaze, his stomach tightening. He hadn't set foot on that bridge since the night of the storm. Lark hadn't either. Even from a distance, she would stiffen at the sound of rushing water beneath it. That evening, the wind rose. Clouds split, unleashing a sudden curtain of rain that swept across the fields. The family huddled in the barn, the lantern light flickering against the wooden beams. Lark shifted restlessly in her stall, hooves striking the straw, breath harsh through her nostrils. June tried to soothe her with whispers, but the mare's fear was too deep, too old. Ethan stood by the open door, watching the downpour blur the line of the hills. Behind him, Caleb's voice broke the silence. "We can't keep hiding from it." Ethan turned. The boy's face was pale, his jaw set. "If we're going to help anyone here, if this place is really going to mean something, we have to face that bridge. You and me. And her." The words cut through the air sharper than thunder. Maya glanced between them, her hand tightening on June's shoulder. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sure," Caleb said, though his hands shook. Ethan hesitated, the weight of memory pressing down. He saw again the slick boards, the fall, the years of silence that followed. But he also saw the torn contract, the neighbor's gifts, the hope flickering in his family's eyes. Maybe Louise had been right. Healing wasn't about erasing scars. It was about walking back into the storm with them. He opened the stall and slipped the halter over Lark's head. She trembled, resisting, but he steadied her with a hand against her neck. "Easy, girl," he whispered. Caleb stepped forward, placing his own hand on the rope. For a moment, father and son stood side by side, united by the same fragile courage. Together they led her out into the rain. The night was cold, the air sharp with the smell of wet earth and pine. The creek roared louder than usual, swollen by the storm. The bridge waited, its boards slick and dark. Lark balked at the sight, muscles tensing, head jerking high. Caleb's grip tightened, his breath ragged. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the harmonica. He hadn't planned it, but his lips found the old tune, soft and steady against the rush of water and rain. The sound threaded through the storm like a lifeline. The mare's ears flicked forward. Her trembling eased just slightly. Caleb stepped closer, pressing his forehead against her cheek. "You can do this," he whispered. "We can do this." For a long moment, nothing moved but the rain. Then slowly, Lark placed one hoof on the first board. The wood creaked under her weight. She froze, eyes wide, but Ethan kept the tune flowing, steady as a heartbeat. Caleb stroked her neck, murmuring encouragement. Another step, then another. The water surged. Below, the storm howled above, but the three of them moved forward as one. By the time they reached the center of the bridge, Ethan's chest ached from holding his breath. Lark stopped, trembling again. Caleb pressed against her side, his voice breaking. "It's okay. I'm here." His words were not just for the horse. They were for his father, too. For the boy who had carried guilt too long. Ethan lowered the harmonica, his voice rough but certain. "We're all here." And then, with a final shudder, the mare took another step, and another, until her hooves met solid ground on the other side. The storm still raged, but in that moment it felt like something had broken free inside them all. A chain unfastened, a shadow lifted. Ethan reached out and gripped Caleb's shoulder, the contact brief but fierce. For the first time, neither pulled away. Behind them, Maya and June watched from the barn door, rain streaking their faces. Maya's hand covered her mouth, tears and rain indistinguishable. June clapped and shouted, her small voice piercing the storm. "She did it! You did it!" Ethan turned back toward the bridge, the rain blurring his vision. "No," he whispered, though no one could hear above the storm. "We did it." The morning after the storm broke clear and brittle, the valley washed clean by rain. Pools of water glistened in the ruts of the gravel road, and the mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. The creek, swollen and restless, still thundered beneath the wooden bridge. Its boards dripped with storm water, darkened and slick, as if the night before had left a mark that daylight could not erase. Ethan stood at the edge with Caleb at his side, the halter rope looped between them. Silverlark snorted, ears flicking nervously, her breath puffing white in the cold air. She remembered. They all did. But today there was no thunder rolling overhead, no lightning splitting the sky, only the steady rush of water below and the quiet determination of those who had chosen to face it. Maya and June waited a few steps back, their hands clasped together. Charlie set up her camera at a respectful distance, her lens catching the morning light on Lark's silver coat. Dr. Hart leaned against the fence post, her presence calm, grounding, as if reminding them that healing was not a moment, but a process. Ethan drew in a long breath. "Ready?" he asked. Caleb nodded, though his throat worked as he swallowed. "She's ready if we are." Together, they stepped forward. Lark hesitated, hooves testing the first plank. The wood creaked under her weight, the sound slicing through the stillness. She flinched, pulling back, but Ethan steadied the rope, while Caleb's hand pressed gently against her neck. "It's all right, girl," Caleb murmured. "We're here." Another step, then another. Each hoofbeat echoed louder than it should have, reverberating through the boards and their bones alike. The creek roared. Below, a reminder of the night that had nearly broken them. But the harmonica tune lingered in memory, and Ethan hummed it low under his breath, soft but steady. Halfway across, Lark froze. Her body quivered, head jerking high, eyes wide. The rope strained, the old fear rushing back. For a heartbeat, the past threatened to drag them under again. Caleb's voice cracked as he whispered, "Dad, what if she can't?" Ethan tightened his grip, his own fear rising. But then he looked at his son, at the boy who had carried guilt heavy enough to silence him for years, who now stood beside him, refusing to let go. He felt something shift inside, a resolve deeper than fear. "Then we carry it with her," he said firmly. "But we don't turn back." Caleb's hand trembled as he stroked Lark's mane. "We don't turn back," he repeated, the words finding strength in his father's voice. Ethan hummed louder, the old tune filling the hollow between them. Slowly, Lark lowered her head, her ears flicking forward. She shifted her weight, one hoof edging forward. The board creaked, but held. Another step. Then another. The trembling eased. The rope slackened in Ethan's hand. And then, almost suddenly, they were across. All three stood on solid ground, the morning light bathing them in gold. Lark exhaled a long, shuddering breath, as if letting go of the storm she had carried in her chest for years. Caleb leaned against her, his forehead pressing into her neck. Ethan reached out, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. For the first time, the contact didn't feel like reaching across a chasm. It felt like standing on the same earth. Behind them, Maya released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. June clapped her small hands, tears and laughter tangled in her voice. Charlie lowered her camera, her expression softened, as though she knew this was not just a story, but a rebirth. Dr. Hart gave a quiet nod, the kind that meant everything and nothing at once. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the sun warm on his face. "We did it," he whispered. Not to the crowd, not even to his family, but to himself, and to the horse who had carried his shame and now his healing. For the first time in years, the bridge no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to them, to this moment, to the choice of moving forward together. Snow arrived quietly, blanketing Paradise Valley in silence. The fields stretched white to the horizon, fences half buried, the river slowed beneath its skin of ice. In the mornings, breath hung in the air like smoke, and the barn carried the warm scent of hay and horseflesh against the sharp cold. For the Rourkes, winter no longer felt like a season of endings. It felt like a pause, a deep breath held before whatever might come next. Ethan stood at the barn door one early evening, watching the sun slip low, staining the snow with rose and gold. Lark shifted in her stall, ears flicking toward him, eyes soft and steady. She looked older than she once had, her back less strong, but to him she had never seemed more alive. She had carried not just weight, but memory, and now she carried hope. He stepped inside, laying a hand on her neck. "You're home," he whispered, and for the first time the words didn't taste like defiance. They tasted like truth. Inside the house, the family gathered around the kitchen table. No torn contracts, no silence sharp enough to wound. Caleb pinned photographs along the wall, prints he had developed in town. June's laughter spilling against Lark's mane. Maya's hands gentle as she tied feed sacks, Ethan leading the mare across the bridge. Each picture told the story they had once been too afraid to speak aloud. Charlie had helped him edit a short film, and already it was traveling online, drawing messages from people far beyond the valley. Veterans, parents, strangers who knew what it meant to be afraid and to keep walking anyway. June tugged at her father's sleeve, pointing to one picture in particular. The three of them, man, boy, and horse, crossing the bridge under rain. Caleb had captured it in grainy light, the water blurred beneath, but the determination clear in their posture. "That one," June said firmly. "That one should hang in the kitchen, where everyone can see." Ethan nodded. Together they placed it above the mantel, where the firelight flickered against its edges. Maya leaned her head against his shoulder, the closeness no longer fragile, but chosen. Her hand found his beneath the table, their fingers lacing together in quiet strength. As night deepened, neighbors stopped by with jars of preserves, kind words and laughter that echoed off the rafters. The ranch was no longer silent. It was becoming something alive, woven together by more than fences and cattle. Dr. Hart arrived with plans to bring families after the new year, speaking of therapy sessions not in clinics but in barns, where healing could happen in the quiet rhythm of brushing a horse's coat. Ethan listened, humbled, realizing this had grown beyond him. Later, when the guests had gone and the fire burned low, Ethan stepped outside once more. Snowflakes drifted soft from the sky, catching in his beard, settling on his jacket. He turned toward the barn, where Lark stood silhouetted in lantern light, her breath rising like smoke against the dark. Caleb joined him, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. For a long moment, they simply stood together, watching the mare. "She's the reason we're still standing," Caleb said quietly. Ethan glanced at his son, then back at the horse. "Maybe," Or maybe she just reminded us how to stand. Caleb smiled faintly, and for once it reached his eyes. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the kind of silence that held room for words yet to come, for mornings not yet lived. Behind them, the house glowed warm against the snow, Maya and June moving. Inside, their laughter faint, but sure. Before them, the valley stretched wide, unyielding, but no longer indifferent. Ethan drew in the cold air and let it out slowly, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. The snow kept falling, steady and quiet, as if the valley itself had chosen to keep them. And in that winter light, nothing felt lost anymore. And now, after walking this emotional journey with Ethan, Caleb, and Lark, I'd love to hear what you felt. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It means more than you know. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because every week we share more true-to-life stories of people and animals that will move you, heal you, and stay with you long after the screen goes dark.